Thank you for listening to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. To send me an email, please use rearviewmirrorchronicles@gmail.com, and to send me a message on WhatsApp, +60 16 425 6301. Hello and welcome to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. My name is Keith Hocton. I'm a public historian, author, and broadcaster. I think this is a really interesting moment to think about empire, and I wanted to talk about the British Empire because I think it's something that's been tucked away in the attic since 1947, when India gained its independence. It hasn't really been spoken about since, and it's not something that you ever learn about at school, which is really weird. And the podcast I'm about to unleash is the most important thing the British ever did in history. I know, it's a big statement, but I think it's true. The British often talk about the First World War and the Second World War, and we learn about that at school. But the British East India Company was an absolutely ginormous chapter in Britain's history, and yet no one talks about it. And I think it's largely because empire now is a dirty word. A bit like colonialism. It's a controversial word. And that's another reason why I think this podcast is particularly important. I think it's important for Indians. I think it's important for Indians that migrated to Britain post-war, because a lot of them are actually asking, especially the younger generation, it's like, why are we here? What happened? And there are Indians writing major books set during the Empire days. So people are actually starting to look at this stuff again. Interestingly, this period, when you look at British TV series, it was looked at very romantically, through like the likes of Merchant Ivory films and so on. And those films are actually now coming up for some very critical evaluation because although they're lovely films, and I love Merchant Ivory, they're not exactly what happened. In the 1970s, you had the glorification of empire, and those films, the Merchant Ivory films and the like, well, they couldn't be made today. They just couldn't. It was all sundowners and, crinoline and white-gloved waiters serving a very white population at places like the Tollygunge Club in Calcutta, with bands playing in the background, Maharajas swooshing around on elephants with, their white overlords shooting tigers. The idea that the empire builders were actually there en masse in industry, heavy industry, sending cloth and spices back to Britain was never really shown. So let's start with the formation of the British East India Company in 1600, and I'll take you all the way through to the beginning of the Raj. Not necessarily in this podcast, because I think it might turn out to be two, but let's see where we go. And the reason why this is important now is that the world has woken up to the fact that the British actually had an empire, and they're not happy about it. Colonialism, as I mentioned, and all that. And that people, nations, entire continents were actually looted, asset stripped, and of course, many, many terrible things happened. That's the first reason. The second reason is, in the last 20 years, we've suddenly been confronted by these massive corporations that now completely dominate our lives. Companies like Tesla, Google, Facebook, ExxonMobil, and other massive corporations that operate almost in every single country of the world, if not every single country of the world. Amazon is actually in a position where it can cut around the tax laws and other laws of individual nation states and play one state off against each other. And suddenly we're in a situation we were with the British East India Company 250 years ago, where a corporation is actually calling the shots and the nation states are on the back foot. In the stories of the East India Company, ultimately the state wins. And in 1858, the East India Company is nationalized and the British state takes over India completely. And this is when you get the beginning of the Raj. But what's funny is that while the Raj has dominated, kind of British perceptions of empire in India, it only actually lasted 90 years. It's a flash in the pan of Indian history. and also even a flash in the pan of British imperialism. It literally lasts from 1858 through to 1947. And this year, we're actually celebrating the 77th anniversary of Indian independence. But what has been forgotten is the bit of the iceberg that you can't see beneath the water, that precedes the beginning of the Raj in 1858. No less than 250 years when India is actually ruled from Britain, but not by the British government, by a British company with an army of 200,000 men, a private army, twice the size of the British army by the year 1800. Isn't that astounding? That's like Amazon having its own private army. So, this whole landscape is so broad, 250 years broad, but I'd like to take you back to the beginning, and before I do that, I'd like to take you to Wales and to Powys Castle. This is an absolutely fascinating place. Powys Castle, from the outside looks about as English as anything could possibly look. And it's actually just over the border from England within Wales. It has Tudor box hedges. It has a wonderful sort of Renaissance doorway in marble. It has these lovely Elizabethan windows, and it has amazing top crenellations. And it would be hard to think of anything more British than this sort of fantastic quintessential castle in the middle of the Welsh countryside. It's the kind of castle that you would actually build on the beach, if you had your sandbox when you were a little kid. But within the long gallery of Powys, you enter a completely different world. As you walk under a very important painting into the gallery, a treasury, really, of what can only be described as Indian loot. It's loot. And of course, loot is an Indian word, to lootna. So loot is a word that the British actually adopted from India, and it means to plunder. And it's a word that enters the English language to describe exactly the sorts of objects which are now filling this castle to the brim and overflowing. And what you have here is amazing tulwars, swords, shields, Indian gowns, beautifully carved ivory chessmen, stunning miniatures, paintings, and one or two quite large objects of imperial plunder of real international importance. There is the jaw-dropping Rajadalas's palanquin, which was left on the battlefield of Plassey and taken by Clive. And it was said that that battle was the battle that started the conquest of India. And it's actually the first moment that the British score a major victory over an Indian power and take a great chunk of territory by force. At the other end of the gallery, you go through this large archway, beautifully carved, and you end up in the Tipu Sultan's extravagant hunting tent. Why is that there? Because another member of the Clive family bought the tent after the Tipu Sultan was conquered by the East India Company in 1799. His palace was then burnt to the ground. It was looted before, and the actual loops of the tent and the tent itself are sitting here in Powys. In actual fact, if you take the whole thing together, there is more Mughal loot, more Mughal artwork and objects in a private house in the Welsh countryside than exists in the National Museum in Delhi, or the National Museum of Pakistan, or the Great Lahore Museum, a stunning museum, or the National Museum of Bangladesh, or any of the museums in Afghanistan and Iran. And the question is, what's it all doing here in a private house? Although it's looked after by the National Trust, the Powys Castle, that is, the objects in the actual museum itself are still the property of the family in Powys. So it begs the question, what's it all doing there? Okay, I'll stop teasing you. When I said you enter this gallery a few minutes ago, and I said you walk under an important picture, that picture is the crucial key to this entire story. And it has a very unhelpful caption beneath it. What it actually says is the Shah Alam conveying the gift of Diwani to Lord Clive. Now, in Britain and in England in particular, there are very few people that would actually understand what that means. But, and this is important, it's a gift that changed the world. The gift of Diwani sounds like a nice little present, something that you might give someone for Christmas, doesn't it? And the picture actually shows a massive court scene with lots of nobles, both Indian and British. On the right are the resplendent Indians and the Mughals. On the left are the British and the gentlemen from the East India Company. In particular, there are two men at the front surrounding the Mughal emperor, almost hemming him in, who are dressed in cloth of gold, almost protectively. And you've got this incredible Indian retinue behind him, also incredibly finely dressed, looking very serious and very grave, I must say. Although it is notable that the most richly dressed man in the painting has his head bowed, almost in supplication. On the British side, the heads are up. So there is a bewigged gentleman in his crimson coat and his gold brocade, and it looks very much straight-backed, ramrod straight. And he's looking directly at the Indian who has his head bowed in supplication, who is dressed in gold, who is clearly in this picture, even if you didn't read the caption, is a potentate. His head is bowed, as I've mentioned, and well might it be bowed, because he is Shah Alam, the Mughal emperor whose ancestors ruled over not just all of India, but Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan. He has just been humbled in battle, defeated by the armies of the British East India Company at the Battle of Buxar in 1765. And he has just been forced to hand over, and you can actually see it in the picture. He's handing over a document to a man in a red coat. That coat and that man wearing it is Robert Clive, sometimes called Clive of India. Interestingly, to this day, his statue stands outside the Foreign Office in Downing Street. And I laugh at the irony of it all, because it really irritates and disgusts Indian dignitaries who walk past it daily. And this picture hanging in Powys is the reason that Indians are disgusted, because Clive of India was not even the servant of the British government. He was the servant of a privately owned company, a corporation no less. And this would be akin, I suppose, to, erecting a statue of Al Capone outside the Supreme Court building, in the US. So Clive isn't appointed by the British government. He is appointed by the directors of the British East India Company. And what he's doing in this picture is taking control of 3 of the richest provinces of the Mughal Empire. Now, I should say immediately that the picture it's a pretty crap picture. It's by a guy called Benjamin West, who's not a great painter. The dome in the background of the painting, it is supposed to be some sort of looming palace, actually, but it actually looks like the dome of St. Paul's. It almost looks exactly like the dome of St. Paul's. And well, it might be, because Benjamin West had never been to India. And everything about this picture is actually a deception, because not only had Benjamin West never been to India, but this scene never really took place. Certainly not in the way that it's being portrayed. It actually took place, and the important document was, transferred and signed in the private tent of Robert Clive after the battle. Basically, he'd put a gun to the head of the defeated emperor and made him sign that document. And according to one Mughal historian who was there, he said the entire ceremony took place quicker than it would normally take to sell a jackass at market. So fake news isn't something that's just been invented, folks. So it's a completely deceptive painting. And then, to add insult to injury, the caption says, as I mentioned earlier, is conveying the gift of Diwani to Lord Clive. The Diwani is basically the right to run the Diwan, which is his imperial treasury. And what it means is that he's giving his imperial treasury the complete control of it, everything that's in there, to the British East India Company. And they are being given the right to run the finances of 3 Indian provinces. Astounding, isn't it? A private company. Now, those three provinces, Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, were in the 18th century, quite simply, the richest three provinces on earth. Anywhere on earth. The looms of those three provinces, of which there were about 1 million of, were churning out a great deal of the revenue, which meant that Mughal India was actually creating nearly 25% of the world's GDP. Think about that, guys. 25% of the world's GDP is being generated by those three states, while at the same time, Great Britain is generating just 1.8%. This is because India has the greatest textile industry of its day. And this is the textile industry that would move in the 19th century, partly because of the events kicked off at this particular moment. Britain eventually gets control of India, and the Indian industries eventually shut down. And we get the great industry of all time, the textile manufacturing, moving to Lancaster in the north of England in the 19th century, all because of what took place right here, right now. Manchester actually gets called Cottonopolis. Isn't that amazing? But this is the moment before that episode. This is the moment when an English company first gets its hands on an incredibly rich territory. And it's done in two stages. The first stage is the Battle of Plassey, and the second stage is the Battle of Buxar. And this signing of the document takes place immediately after the second battle, when the East India Company has subdued all opposition in North India. And I think this is one that we can actually circle back to, because I still want to tell you, and this is the question that Indians ask all the time, how is it that in numbers, the Indians outnumbered the British? They outnumbered the East India Company. In arms, they were more powerful. And yet, here we are, a group of adventurers, a group of pirates managed to subdue and control a country as vast as India. So let's go right back to the first birth whale, the cradle whale of what would become the East India Company. And this is really, really fascinating. It all starts with a man by the name of Customer Smythe. So the East India Company is just a company. It's a corporation. Effectively, it's a startup. And the guy who has the idea for this startup, the founder of this company, is a man called Customer Smythe, or Auditor Smythe. So called because he was actually an auditor. In other words, he's the guy who ends up running the customs and the customs of London. And he's kind of the Richard Branson of his day, or the Vijay Mallya of his day. And he's an entrepreneur. He's made a lot of money. His dad was a big entrepreneur before him, so he inherited money. But he's hugely enlarged that fortune. And so when the news comes in the late 1590s during, and this is the year of Elizabeth I, I suppose, so she's probably about 80 years old, an old woman now, and everyone is wondering what's going to happen when she dies. This is also the year that William Shakespeare, is writing both Hamlet and Julius Caesar. And if you'd walked from the Globe Theatre in 1599 over the bridge into what was then Moorgate Fields, now it's a grotty kind of little tube station, but in those days it was actually fields, as the name suggests. And in the middle of these gorgeous fields is this black and white Tudor building called Founders Hall. Customer Smythe hires that for a day, and he calls all the rich investors, the people whom he thinks can invest in this incredible venture, this idea that he has. And what he says is that the Dutch have just gone to the East Indies. And of course, by the East Indies, he means what we now call the island of Java in Indonesia, not India initially. And the early days of the company is aimed not at India, interestingly, but at Indonesia and the Moluccas, and even beyond the Spice Islands, out to the edge of Papua New Guinea. And for most people, this was the end of the earth. I mean, it really was. There were no maps, really, that detailed those kind of areas. And he had the idea that if the Dutch can get there and buy spices, cutting out all the middlemen, cutting out the Arabs, cutting out the Venetians, cutting out the North Europeans, then so could the English. And he appeals to their Tudor patriotism. And he calls in a lot of people that we would today were absolutely pirates, who actually call themselves privateers. But let's not, blot the canvas. These guys were pirates, and they had been for a number of years. So they called themselves privateers, And privateers are effectively people who have been licensed by the state, by the Queen, by Elizabeth I, to loot the treasure ships moving gold and silver and other precious objects from South America to Spain and to Portugal. I mean, I'm very familiar with this topic. I've written about it. I've read an awful lot about it. But to somebody who isn't, this is actually an astonishing thing, that the state is actually giving full power to robbers to effectively go and rob. And to the guys who are doing it, it's essentially quite a familiar situation, because in the immediate run-up to this, England literally just cut itself off from the continent. And again, it's England. It's not Ireland, Scotland, or Wales, because the union of that didn't take place until 1707. So this is just England at this stage. And they've done it because the Reformation has just taken place, and it's cut England off from southern Europe. And countries like Spain and Portugal now regard England as a very dangerous enemy state. And there's an awful lot of rivalry. And this is, keep in mind, this is just 20 years or 18 years after the Spanish Armada has been defeated. Philip II of Spain has just died. And there's an awful lot of dislike of Catholic Spain and the Popish continent. And even the European Protestants are not particularly friendly towards the English. And the Dutch, who are Protestant, have just broken free from Spain, and they have made this pioneering visit to the Spice Islands and made an absolute fortune. And the reason the Dutch are so important is because they've discovered a route around the Cape of Good Hope, which the Portuguese had actually kept secret for a very long time. And this actually makes trafficking their trade incredibly lucrative. So that route had actually been founded, first of all, by Vasco da Gama some 50 years earlier. And that's why Portugal managed to create this incredible empire some 50 years before. But the Dutch, well, they're more vicious. They buy better sailing boats. They build better sailing boats. They've got better cannon, and they have deeper pockets. So they're financed well, and they get to areas on the very edge of the globe, the very edge of Portuguese influence, where the spices grow, and they take over. And what sets the English off is a visit by a group of Dutch shippers to London who try and buy up all the London shipping in order that they can make more voyages to the East Indies. And Customer Smythe basically says, hang on, guys, you're not taking our ships. We can do this ourselves. So he calls this meeting in the same year that Julius Caesar and Hamlet is first performed at the Globe. Isn't that an astounding thing? You know, we take Shakespeare so much for granted these days, but this is the first time that it's being performed in the world. So the meeting is called in this black and white Tudor hall, and bizarrely, we actually have all the documents. Everything from the East India Company is kept. Every single note that they made is kept in their archives. And every single note from this first meeting can still be viewed. And one of the most tantalizing documents in this collection is the actual signing of the allocating of the shares. Yes, there were privateers who were signing up for this, but there were also lots of what we would call kind of Marks and Spencer shareholders, you know, people from every single walk of life. So that document is actually in the British Library. And if you buy William Dalrymple's book, The Anarchy, which I can't say enough about, by the way, it's actually the history, the complete history in detail of the British East India Company. It actually shows the first people signing up are the grandees. You know, the Mayor of London, who puts in £300. Another lord puts in £1,000. But what's really interesting is that by page 20 of this document, you have the ordinary people signing up for shares, vintners, you know, people who sell wine, leather workers, saddle makers. And, you know, they might only be putting in £1 or £5, but they're all buying into this startup. And what has happened is that Elizabethan England has invented this new mechanism for doing business. It's called stock shares. And I know that we're all so familiar of it now, but keep in mind, this is the first time that in this era that this has actually happened. Before that, you actually had the guilds, and the guilds still exist today. The guilds were a bit like this, in that that you had to be either a wool maker. If you were part of the wool makers guild, then only you could actually invest in that particular guild and whatever venture they had. So if you're a wool maker, most of those guilds came from Suffolk. They get together, they pool their resources, and they go off and cut a big deal, with the tapestry makers in Holland, for example, or Belgium. But to be a member of a guild, you have to be, or that particular, as an example, you have to be a wool worker. And you have to have something to do with the wool industry. The ordinary man in the street can't buy in. And what's new about these joint stock companies, which is, an idea that Elizabethan England has actually come up with in 1518, the first company, which was the Muscovy Company. And the Muscovy Company was aimed at trade with Moscow and Russia, and they sold furs and, all the goods from the forest, from the Russian steppes. And when they found that they had this new model and that, you could actually, it wasn't just merchants that could buy into it, anyone could, suddenly it started with a whole plethora of ideas and a whole plethora of companies, kind of starting up. And with this new venture, if you're a massive investor, you get a massive share of the profits. If you're a small investor, you get a small share of the profits. But the point being that it's a new vehicle for people to get on board with. And of course, this idea changes absolutely everything, because suddenly you have the growth of companies. And these companies, if they're popular, can raise vast sums of money very, very quickly. And if they fail, well, they fail. And so what happens, interestingly, is that the Elizabethan state outsources a lot of its colonial activity to merchant companies, not to the state itself. I mean, it's an incredibly smart move. It cuts overheads, and it sort of makes sense in so many other ways. If you're an exchequer and you've got things on your mind like, wars with France or, Spain or Holland, or, people threatening your borders, then the last thing you want to administer is to administer the expensive of a startup company. So it works for the government and it works for the privateers. So from this time, you get the Muscovy Company, you get the Royal Africa Company, which deals in slaving. You get the Hudson Bay Company, which still exists today, which deals with all the furs from the north of America, which of course is now Canada. You get the Rhode Island Company, which controls Rhode Island, and you get the Virginia Company controlling the state of Virginia. So you get all these different areas which are actually run by merchant corporations, private investors. And so the East India Company is part of this big game. It's not the first, but it's about to become one of the most important. So while I was doing all this research, I then started to wonder what Customer Smythe was like. What kind of person was he? And, I said that he was very much like Richard Branson. And a lot of these companies, these days actually run on the energy of the starter, the starter's charisma, Elon Musk, Richard Branson, just to give you two examples. So I wondered what he was like. And I guess the interesting thing is we only have his likeness and his letters to go by. But by all accounts, he was this sort of very Elizabethan guy with a tall stovepipe hat, very pale. He had a goatee beard, and he was well-to-do. He was one of the new rich, a one-generation old fortune. And he's exactly the sort of individual who is rising up at this time to do exactly this. Absolutely full of entrepreneurial energy, but also incredibly ruthless. You had to be to do business at this stage. So we're talking the new rich, the nouveau riche. Think of all those characters in the Shakespeare plays who from this image emerge, who end up being, kind of cast away on islands, like the Tempest. He's a London boy, he's a London businessman, and he's connected with other London businessmen, and he's also connected with the privateers. And he gathers these guys into a meeting and says, invest in my company, we'll get some spices, and I'll make you all very rich. And they all go, all right, that sounds like a good deal. Let's do exactly that. And as I said, we have this document which shows the large sum of money which is raised through this public meeting, something like £7 million in today's money. And we even have the description of the meeting, because there was a young Richard Hatlett who will go on to write wonderful travel accounts and compile incredible accounts of travelers at this time. He's actually hired to be the kind of notary, keeping the records for this first meeting. And what he's doing is writing history. these guys know that they're about to do something special. They're about to do something very historic. The atmosphere in there was electric. It said that when Customer Smythe actually spoke, it gave them goosebumps. These are hardened sea dogs. To do that to one of these guys means that he must have been an amazing orator, and to get them on board immediately, he must have been very compelling. And of course, keep in mind, guys, there's no guarantee, like any startup, this is actually going to work. And in fact, there are two very good reasons for wondering whether this is a good way to spend your money. First off, the man they hire to sail for the first voyage is a man called Captain Sir James Lancaster. I've spoken about James Lancaster in the past. I'm a great admirer of his, but he wasn't a great sailor. In fact, he'd just come back from a disastrous voyage in the same area. Anyway, he's employed because he's the only man that actually sailed there that they can find. But he didn't sail back from there because his ship sank and all his crew got eaten by cannibals. So he wouldn't have been my first choice. One thing I will say about Lancaster very briefly is that Lancaster actually landed on the island of Penang in 1591. And as far as records go, he's the first Englishman that we know of that landed on Penang Island. Now, here's the connection, the 6 degrees of separation, guys. Lancaster goes back an incredibly rich man, which I'll tell you about in a second, and becomes a director of the East India Company. The East India Company end up landing on the island of Penang in 1756. So here's the question for you. If Lancaster hadn't landed here, would the East India Company have even been a success? I think the answer to that's probably yes. But would they have come back to the island of Penang in 1756? Something to ponder. So in the weeks of the first meeting, they've got their cash and they're gathering it from their shareholders. We even have notes saying, X and Y hasn't paid up yet. And, let's send them a legal notice because they promised £1, £10, £50, whatever it is. And they haven't delivered it. Go and chase them. But once the money's been raised, they go to Deptford and they look for a ship. And the first ship they find is a creaky old tub called the Mayflower. That's right, the Mayflower, which they actually reject because they think it's not seaworthy. I bet no one tells the Pilgrims that. And then they buy a pirate ship called the Scrounge of Malice. I mean, that sounds like Johnny Depp's flagship, doesn't it, from Pirates of the Caribbean? And of course, they don't keep the name because it's a pirate name. It's not a good name or a lucky name, for that matter, for a ship. So they change it to the Red Dragon. Almost sounds like a pub in the English countryside. So, there's no guarantee that this will work. This is a startup, and initially it doesn't. They set sail, and they immediately get becalmed in the channel because of a freak heat wave, and there's no breeze. But the breeze picks up, and of course, they set sail. And to their own surprise, they end up rounding the Cape of Good Hope. And what I find really amazing, because we have all the ship's records, is that they actually perform one of Shakespeare's 2 plays on their deck, which I think is absolutely wonderful. So keep in mind, this is armed commerce from the very beginning. The charter that they wring out of the Elizabethan court actually allows them to wage war explicitly on their enemies. And they will fight their way through anything if they have to. And of course, they employ people with cannon experience and archers and all of the above. They're all ex-privateers anyway, and very experienced seamen and soldiers to protect that particular charter. And let's just take a short break for a message from our sponsor. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Autonomous or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. And we are back. So the Red Dragon eventually gets to the East Indies, meaning Java and of course Indonesia. And just as they're about to land, all the troops are getting ready. They see a Portuguese caravel coming in the opposite direction. They land on the Portuguese ship, they seize it, and they immediately transfer its contents to their own hold and basically sail back home again. They've done nothing apart from steal from the Portuguese. So not only does this require no effort, or very little, but no lives are lost, no money is spent, and they end up back in England laden with spices. So they take their entire cargo to market, which is basically nutmeg and various other spices, and they sell it for £1 million, which is roughly £75 million today, give or take a penny. How ridiculously successful is that? And so then begins a very tricky 30 years where they're competing against the Dutch primarily, because the Dutch have actually kicked out the Portuguese and taken control of all their, warehouses and islands. And the Dutch are the ones that now have to be contended with. It's a new nation. They're an aggressive nation. As I said to you before, they have fantastic financial instruments and they're brilliant financiers, which at this stage, the Tudors are not. What that points to is that they can raise money very quickly when they need to. And the Tudors at this stage are very much the beginners, very much the new guy on the block. And what then takes place is a nasty war that goes on between the two countries for the next 30 years. And basically by around 1630, the British have actually kind of given up. It's been a success, but it hasn't been the success story that they wanted it to be, primarily because the Dutch are too strong. And there was also a series of disasters. There was the Amboina massacre, which took place where a lot of British sailors were actually captured and then tortured to death by the Dutch. Just on that note, when that news got back to London, the Dutch ambassador was run out of the embassy and he barely escaped with his life. In return, many, many years later, the Dutch actually turn around and give the British New Holland as a reparation, which of course then turns into the island of Manhattan. And that's actually an amazing story by itself. And of course, Manhattan turns out to be an incredible investment in the long run as well. But in the short term, this is all rather humiliating for the British. And rather like a startup which has gone awry and, the investors haven't quite got their return, they're a little bit disappointed, but they're not giving up yet because they can still see light at the end of the tunnel and they still think there's potential. And the business model at this particular time is being rejigged. It gets rejigged around about 1630, 1640. And what the British decide to do is basically forget about the spice trade. They leave that to the Dutch. They can't compete. And to be honest, I think there's already signs that the great days of the spice trade have passed, that, prices of spices are actually coming down. So the English, they're not completely heartbroken to their quest. What they realize is that the new trade, the really exciting trade, is textiles. So we're talking about textiles coming in from Bengal, and the majority of textiles were coming from that particular area. And we're talking at this stage about soft cottons. So initially, the big mogul port is Surat, which is in Gujarat, and Gujarat is the center of the cotton trade. What's interesting, I think, is cotton to us now is actually very ordinary, isn't it? I mean, I'm wearing a simple cotton, white shirt as we speak, and it's unremarkable. And I think, I paid maybe $20-30 for it. But at the time, cotton was considered a luxury product because it's incredibly soft on the skin. And keep in mind, cotton is an ancient export. This was being exported from India to the Romans almost 2,000 years before. So Gujarati cotton was actually as valuable as silk. And, as with spices, we can now go into Waitroses or Sainsbury's or Tesco's or, Woolworths, and you can buy pepper, by the pound without really thinking about it. And it doesn't really cost a great deal. It's not a luxury product because of the sheer quantity. The supplies meant that the prices sunk almost immediately. So Britain had made the right choice. But the British were actually wearing wool before cotton, which obviously is not suitable for the tropics. And so they buy cotton from the Gujaratis, and they begin to get involved in all the incredible, more exotic, exciting textiles that they then find that are being produced in Bengal. Muslin, which is incredibly fine, which is often see-through. Silks, wonderful embroideries, thing called kalamkaris, which are, painted, and you hang them from the end of your Tudor bed, your four-poster Tudor bed. And this is a very, very good moment to be in the textile trade. And I don't think this was particularly planned because, there's absolutely no question they just lost the Battle of Spices against the Dutch. But by moving from the spice trade to the textile trade, they're moving and changing the focus from Indonesia to India. And this is a really canny decision in the scheme of things, effectively because you have the whole of the textile trade to yourself. Well, not quite the whole field because, there are still a few Portuguese in Goa, and the East India Company, has a few dust-offs with the Portuguese, but it doesn't really cost them that much. But nonetheless, they're in early. And the Mughals who now run India, well, they've come down from Uzbekistan, and they've taken over the north and the middle of India. And by 1640, Shah Jahan, who goes and builds the Taj Mahal, which was a podcast that I did earlier in the year, is on the throne. And the Mughal Empire at this stage is incredibly rich and incredibly willing to do trade. But these guys are Central Asian nomads. They're not interested in the navy, they're interested in the land, and they're interested in trade. And eventually this all plays into British East India Company hands. So the Mughals are incredibly rich. They're actually the richest men in the world. And I think what's really interesting is at this particular time, they actually don't give a arse for the British. And there's a later picture which is really informative. And in it, it's really interesting because you can see Jahangir, who's the Mughal emperor at this particular stage, as the millennial sultan. He's actually pictured preferring the company of Sufi priests rather than the English. And this painting has been painted by Bichta, who was an incredible, Mughal artist. And it's a remarkable thing. Because what you see when you look at this is Jahangir, who's actually floating, who's got this great golden disc behind him, looking very resplendent and very important. And he's actually handing over, I would presume, a religious text to a Sufi scholar. But in the left-hand corner is a teeny-weeny James I. And the face is incredibly detailed, and he looks really pissed off. But what this actually tells you, what this picture tells us, is that Jahangir prefers the Sufi to James I, King of England and Scotland, and that James I actually means nothing to this very powerful man at court. The Emperor Akbar later talks about Northerners as being like animals. These Europeans he actually regards as semi-savage. The British and the French and the Portuguese, these northern Europeans. The British actually have a really good chance of taking the entire Indian textile market and exporting it around the globe. And in fact, that's exactly what they do. And they do this incredibly well. And by the early 18th century, the British have de-industrialized as far as Mexico. And effectively, there's so much cheap Indian cotton of a high quality and very low cost being exported by the British to the entire world. And these guys are buying bolts of raw material. In most cases, they're not commissioning anything at all, and they're literally shipping it not just to Britain, but to all over the world. And when you go, for example, to lovely Renaissance palaces in Italy, on your summer holidays, and you can often see this exported cotton still on the walls. Mughal Kankaris, which presumably got there because they were put there, exported there by the British East India Company. England gets its cotton, and the Mughal weavers get their money, and they all live happily ever after. And for a long time, they actually did. And both the Mughals and the East India Company prosper spectacularly during this period. And everything actually goes quite well until Aurangzeb, who is this Mughal emperor who manages to mess everything up. What's that old saying? The grandfather makes the fortune, the father grows the fortune, and the son squanders the fortune. Well, Aurangzeb was that guy. And the first thing that he does is that he irritates all the Hindus by reimposing a religious tax on non-believers. And basically what he says is, sure, you want to worship your own God? Your God's not an Islamic God? Okay, then you pay tax. And basically, since the time of Akbar, the Mughal Empire has been incredibly successful collaborative deal between them, the Rajput armies who are Hindu, who are eventually defeated in battle. But then rather than being punished or being looted, the Mughals are actually very smart. They bring them into the Mughal fold, and they become the spearhead of the Mughal armies. So for quite a lot of the Mughal rule, you actually find Hindu Mughal armies attacking minor Muslim sultans halfway down India, in the Deccan. So, Bijapur and Golconda, all these little southerners, these little southern states are actually being attacked by Hindu armies working for the Mughals. So it's actually the opposite in the sense of what you'd expect, which is why today, when, as an example, one goes to Rajasthan, if you go to the town of Bikner, there's a wonderful library, absolutely amazing library, where you find the best Deccani manuscripts which have been looted from this period from Middle India. So Aurangzeb is messing things up. And when he dies in 1707, the Mughal Empire begins to fail and fall. The Jats, the Sikhs, and the Maharathas are rising up. And actually, any one of them could have taken the Mughals out. But in the end, it's this odd character from out of town, Nader Shah, a Persian, who comes to Delhi, loots everything, takes cartloads of loot, about 8,000 wagon loads of loot from the imperial treasury, and the Mughal Empire disintegrates. Where previously they had a single unitary state, beautifully administered, by local governors in every corner of the empire, over now, which would be 4 different countries, suddenly every town is semi-independent. Jodhpur, Jaipur, Hyderabad, Udaipur. You can't pay the administrators or the armies because the money's been stolen, and the empire disintegrates. In that extraordinary transformation of India from a massive empire to tiny self-governing states jostling up against each other, 2 European corporations make merry. They couldn't have been happier. One is the East India Company, which is based in Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay. But there's now a rival French East India Company called the Compagnie des Indes, which is based in Pondicherry and Chandernugga. And they have shadow factories opposite the English ones in almost every place. And it's incredibly hostile. The English have hated the French for millennia, and in the whole of the 18th century, there's a global conflict between France and England, which manages to manifest itself, first of all, in the Austrian succession and eventually the 7 Years' War. But finally, this global conflict arrives in India. The British are also fighting the French in Lake Huron in the north, in the United States and in Canada. The last of the Mohicans, all that kind of stuff with Daniel Day-Lewis. Also in the Caribbean and as far away as the Philippines. So in the middle of all this, of the English and the French fighting it all out, is a young man called Robert Clive, who actually gets involved in a whole lot of skirmishes in India, which they called the Carnatic Wars. But let me explain who Robert Clive is. Robert Clive is exactly the person that you want, that you need at this particular moment to join the British East India Company. He's from a poshish background. His father's a local squire, so he's a squire's son. But effectively, lots of social aspirations, but not much money. And a lot of these people, this gentry, this middle-class kind of gentry, are being signed up by the East India Company because effectively it's not a bad way of making a living. And if you're a sort of minor gentry that has high social aspirations, but you simply don't have the money to support it anymore, to put one of your kids out to the British East India Company is a great option. It's a bit like, these days, getting your kid into Goldman Sachs. However, Clive by nature is a petty criminal, and there is a whole bunch of letters from his uncle which survive, which have him being the village bully, the minor village bully. He has protection rackets going against women shopkeepers in Shropshire. He's breaking the windows of shopkeepers who won't pay up at the end of every week, and he even floods somebody's shop just out of spite. So he's sort of this unruly adolescent isn't really the word for him, but I suppose that'll describe him, who's sent off by his uncle to join the British East India Company in India, where he signed up as a writer, which is the lowest of the low. And of course, being an unruly delinquent, he hates it. And he hates it so much, he actually twice tries to shoot himself, and for various reasons, he fails both signs. So a bit of a sad character in many ways. But he regards this as sort of almost divine, a mandate, that he wasn't able to commit suicide, and he's been spared for greater things. And so when war breaks out between France and England, he signs up to become a soldier. He moves away from the writing part. And as it turns out, unlike, accountancy, which is effectively what the writers were, he finds something that's completely up his street. And keep in mind, he's not a professional soldier. He's an employee of the British East India Company, but he takes to it like duck to water. And here's the important thing. He's actually trained up by various veterans of the Culloden War. And together, Clive and some of his mates basically outwit the French company. The French company is hobbled, partially because it's state-run. The guys who are actually running it can't make their own decisions. They have to go back to the court in Versailles to get every single change approved. And unlike the British company, which is sort of very libertarian and, kind of trusting and full of hungry, ruthless, ambitious young men like Clive, with the French, you kind of get dim aristocrats. Aristocrats that haven't really made it in France, but might make it if they go to India. And of course, they don't have much freedom of movement. As I said, everything has to go through Versailles and the king. And of course, the king at this stage is too busy with his mistresses and all that kind of stuff. And it takes forever to make a decision. So the arrival of Clive coincides with the moment that the British East India Company clearly gets an upper hand over the French. And Clive makes his first fortune at this point and quickly comes back to England and goes into Parliament. With Clive, though, he can't move away from his childhood ways, and there's an immediate scandal over the fact that he's bribed almost everyone in his constituency to get things moving. And of course, quite soon, after having given some of his money to his dad, and he's bought some land, in Ireland, he finds his coffers, which he thought would be enough to retire on, exhausted, basically within 4 years. So he has to sign back up again with the British East India Company. And he's lucky to the extent that Clive always seems to be in the right place at the right time. And he signs up at exactly the moment when England and France are heading to war again. And this is going to be the conflict that will finally break out in 1756, 1757, that the Americans and the French called the Indian Wars, which in Britain is called the 7 Years' War. Again, it's a global conflict between Britain and France in all their different colonies and territories. And, rather like the Iraq War a few years ago, everything is set off by a false piece of intelligence. A document is delivered to the British East India Company saying that we've just seen the French loading an enormous flotilla in their main base, Port Loyal, and it's going off to Bengal. And it's very detailed. There's actually descriptions of the number of cannons they have, the number of warships that they have, that they're battle ready, the amount of food that they have. And the document, well, let's just say the document is not completely wrong. And there was a big flotilla, but they've actually got the destination wrong. And it's not actually heading to India at all. It's heading to Canada. The British East India Company effectively goes to the British Navy, the British government, and says, hey, we've got to protect our interests in India. Well, we're about to be wiped off the face of the earth. So the Royal Navy produces some ships. Clive is recruited on the company's side. And so what you have is like this joint sort of Royal Navy and Marine and East India Company expedition. And of course, when they arrive in Madras, they find there is no French presence. There's no opposition at all because the French fleet are heading to Canada. And the British have traveled halfway around the world. It's taken them 6 months and there's no one there. So what the hell are they to do? And interestingly, Clive's career almost ends at this point, but it's saved by one single event that takes place in Calcutta. The new governor of Bengal is called Siraj Dowlah. And he is an angry, spoiled young man who's effectively fallen out with everyone. However, he is the beloved nephew of Ali Verdi Khan, who had been the governor of Bengal for years, but he has none of Ali Verdi Khan's tact, diplomacy, smarts, or sense of state. And he's actually famous for filling pleasure boats, full of homeless people and then sinking them just to watch people drown. He's a serial seducer of women who then takes these women and then walls them up and leaves them to die. I mean, he's a total scumbag. Anyway, he attacks Calcutta effectively on the grounds that the British have been rebuilding the fortifications of Calcutta without his permission. And they have. He's the governor and they should have asked. Effectively, he's basically saying, sorry, guys, you didn't get planning permission and you have to stop. And not only will you stop, but I'm going to invade you. And what he thinks is that they must be rearming and refortifying themselves against him. Because, a lot of his bankers have recently arrived in Calcutta to collect money, and the British are resisting them. They're resisting paying any taxes to Siraj Dowlah. And of course, the British are actually aiming their refortifications against the French because they've been given this intelligence. And we know this because all these incredible documents still survive. So it's all about the misinformation at this stage. They think the French are going to India. The French are actually going to Canada. Siraj Dowlah thinks that they're actually repairing the fort because, and they're doing it to protect themselves from him, but they're actually doing it because they think the French are on their way. So there's this massive amount of misinformation that takes place. So when news arrives that Siraj Dowlah has attacked Calcutta and put a lot of the British into jail, where they have effectively died of heat exhaustion in something called the Black Hole of Calcutta, which is in 1756, and that the city has fallen, Clive suddenly has meaning and he has a job. And he heads north with this massive army that he has to effectively retake Calcutta. The Black Hole of Calcutta is quite interesting because that's actually something that we did learn about at school. And I think everybody knows about the Black Hole of Calcutta, but there's a lot of misinformation about it. And the misinformation is that hundreds of people were forced into this inhuman, oxygen-less hole in the ground and left to die. Men, women, and children. And of course, it's a very pitiful, very sad story. Since the days of that information, we've managed to uncover a lot more information about what actually took place. And those stories are now being disputed. What's clear is that a lot of people died, but that the numbers seem to be hugely exaggerated. And of course, the reason why they were put in there has been completely ignored. So we used to think it was Siraj Dowlah took Calcutta and then basically for no reason whatsoever decided to put hundreds of British subjects in this hole. And of course, that isn't the case. What happened was when the British lost Calcutta, a lot of them got very drunk and then ran amok and started shooting at guards and ordinary citizens. And Dullah's troops quite reasonably said, we can't have this. We can't have all these people running around shooting people. So what they effectively did was they rounded them up and they locked them in the guard room in this tight, dark space. And with the new information coming forward, we think they now locked up about 60 people and only about 30 of them walked or crawled out. And look, it was a situation that probably didn't need to take place. There was definitely some extremely unfortunate and unavoidable deaths, but it definitely wasn't a sort of dastardly plot that when Dowlah invaded Calcutta, that he had an idea in his head that he was just going to kill all the Europeans. From all the information that we now have, that definitely wasn't the case. The British definitely misbehaved, and it was these unruly prisoners under lock and key that suffered. But I mean, effectively, from the information that we've seen, they were looking to put them elsewhere, and this was just a holdover until somewhere better was found. I honestly don't think it was a premeditated event. And by the time that Clive then arrives in Madras, this story is kind of out there and it gives him a mandate for what then follows. Clive is going to liberate this captured city. He's going to vindicate British honor. And of course, he's going to make a name for himself and teach these savages, who massacred British, women and children a lesson. And of course, Clive's got a big navy. He's there with the British Marines. And he's also taken on the British East India Company's own nascent mercenary army, who are effectively the sepoys, who he's trained up a bit. And there's not many of them at this point. I think there's a few thousand of them. But effectively, they do their job, and they've got muskets, and they have a mission. And he arrives in Bengal, and effectively he captures Calcutta without much opposition at all. The enemy runs. It's not a very difficult task given the armaments that he has. And he then gets news that the French have actually declared war on England and the 7-Year War has begun. So he then takes the second town, which is Chandamugha, from the French, and there is this enormous sea battle, in fact, using naval ships on the Hooghly River, and lots of people are actually killed on both sides. So what started out as a very easy taking of Calcutta resulted in him then routing the French. And at this point, Clive writes to his dad that he's heading home, that he's made his second fortune, his name is made, and he now should be set up for life. There's no need for dad to worry. And this is where history changes. So just as Clive is heading back to Madras and planning to cash in his chips, another nice little victory, thank you very much, a letter arrives that changes everything, that will change history. And this is a letter from a man called Juggernaut Seth, banker to the world. And the Juggernaut Seths are like I guess they're like the Rothschilds of the 19th century Europe. There are these incredibly rich, very political bankers, and they've invented a very clever system of transferring funds from around India in a time of disruption. In the old days, if Bengal was being taxed, effectively what they would do is they would load everything into wagons, thousands of wagons, and they would then put a troop of soldiers around the wagons, and it would literally travel from Calcutta, overland, up the Ganges, all the way to Delhi. And of course, with numerous war bands and numerous people at war now roaming around India, that's no longer a possibility. And the Juggernaut Seths come up with this incredible credit idea that basically, if you pay the tax into their office in Calcutta, they issue you with a chit. A small piece of paper saying that they owe you X. And if you take that to Delhi, you can hand that chit in and your money will be handed over to you. I mean, it feels like such a modern concept, And of course, the Juggernaut Seths take 10 to 15% of the tax. And given this is the main source of money for the Mughal Empire, they make a fortune very, very quickly, and very quickly become the richest people in the whole of Asia. According to one Mughal source, money flows into the coffers of the Juggernaut Seths like the Ganges flows into the sea. And so these guys reach out to Clive, and what they say is, hey, we see you've just taken Calcutta. We've got a proposal for you. We think that Siraj Dullah is a complete psycho. He's threatened us. He's forced us to give him loans. He doesn't repay the loans. He's threatened to circumcise us and make us Muslims if we continue to hassle him for our money. What we propose is that you attack Siraj Dullah at his capital in Murshidabad, and we pay off his generals so that they don't fight. And for that service, Mr. Clive, we pay you personally £1 million, £75 million in today's money. And not only that, we will pay your company another £1 million for letting us use you. It means that Clive instantly becomes the richest self-made man in Europe overnight. And the fact that the company has been offered $1 million means that Clive thinks he can effectively get away with it. So Clive goes north, and for a week there's a terrible silence, and he wonders whether he's falling into a trap because there's no letters reaching him, there's no contact. But he brasses it out and takes his troop to a battlefield in Palashi. And of course, this is known in the English textbooks as Palasi, but it's actually Palashi. And a Palashi is a type of tree. A Palash tree is this gorgeous, tree that produces wonderful bright blossoms in April. And in the morning, he actually finds that the Mughal army has completely encircled him. And there's a terrible moment when it all looks like it's a trap. He's bitten off more than he can chew, and this is the end. And then firing starts from this army, who are incidentally supported by a French contingent. And they're pretty keen to wipe out the English. And Clive immediately has to hide his army. So they hide on the banks of the river, they hide in the mangrove groves, and it looks like they're going to get wiped out and sent back to Calcutta in boxes that same night. But at this vital moment, a monsoon storm, one of the worst they've had in years, breaks, and there's a terrific downpour. And while the British remember to cover their gunpowder with tarpaulins, guess what? The Mughals and the French don't. It's a colossal mistake. And had they done so, it would have turned history. It's the most basic thing. And of course, the Mughal cavalry think that the same thing must have happened to the English and that the English cannon are out of commission. And of course, as soon as the monsoon breaks, they attack. The cavalry charge. And they're met by an enormous volley from the English cannon, killing all the leaders and wiping out 3/4 of the cavalry. Mir Jafar, who is actually the general in charge of the Mughal cavalry, is actually getting paid by the juggernaut as well. And he decides to take his army and he marches it off the battlefield. Siraj Dula realizes that he's been betrayed and he's off and running. He's scampering away. But, of course, he's captured. He's hacked to bits and his mutilated body is then paraded on the back of a donkey through Murshidabad. The next day, Clive actually walks into Murshidabad with the juggernaut and literally helps himself to everything in the treasury. Everything. Years later, when he's called before Parliament, rather like, sort of Boris Johnson being called in, I imagine Clive is a very similar kind of character. He kind of brazens it out and he says, "My lords, there was a prostrate city at my feet. The bankers waited on my pleasure. My lords, I was astonished at my own moderation." And the legend of Moderation Clive continues. And effectively, he just laughs it off and he gets away with it. So what happens then is that Clive is then paid his million by the juggernauts. And of course, keep in mind, he's already looted the entire treasury. But what's interesting is that 8 years later, all the people that Clive has put into power as puppets again rise up against the English because the English have behaved so incredibly badly. And basically, they end up killing the goose that was laying the golden egg. In just 8 years, they lay waste to Bengal by asset stripping it. And there was another big act of resistance too, and not just the Nawab of Bengal this time, who was also put in by Clive, but also the Nawab of Uttar Pradesh and the Mughal emperor himself, Shah Alam. All of these characters end up meeting at the Battle of Buxar, and they take on the mighty East India Company. But again, the company has used the money that it's gathered over the ensuing 8 years to enormously increase the size of its sepoy army, and it's bought an enormous number of sepoys. There are now 40,000 of them trained, hardened to be used at the company's discretion, and they've all been trained in the latest European techniques of warfare. There's horse artillery, there's 18th century ballistics, there's muskets, there's bayonets, and this is an incredibly hard-fought battle. But in the end, the East India Company army defeats all three of these armies massed together. And this is the moment when Clive returns to India and makes Shah Alam sign the Diwani. And suddenly you find that the richest provinces of India, Bengal and Bihar and Orissa, are signed over not to the British government, not to the British Army, but to a private corporation, the British East India Company. And folks, this is just the beginning. This is where the company moves from being a trading company to an imperial territorial power. And if you want to find out what happens next, please listen to the next podcast. It's very exciting. I actually just had goosebumps just thinking about it just then. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me, and I'll look forward to speaking to you next week. Bye for now.